I swear it's not what you think. My husband let go of my cousin's hand so fast he nearly knocked over the wine glass between them. That was the first thing I saw when I walked into the restaurant. Not the flowers on the table. Not the candlelight. Not the little happy anniversary card propped beside Robert's steak knife. Just his hand covering Elaine's. And both of them looking guilty in completely different ways. Elaine looked terrified. Robert looked prepared. Prepared men are sometimes worse than lying men. Because preparation means this moment already existed in their mind before you arrived. I stood there holding my purse against my coat, feeling 63 years old all at once. Not old physically. Old emotionally. The hostess beside me smiled awkwardly like she wanted to disappear into the carpet. People hate witnessing private pain in public places. Especially nice restaurants. Robert stood immediately. Diane. Elaine pulled her hand into her lap so quickly her bracelet snagged against the tablecloth. I can explain, Robert said. Then Elaine whispered something barely above a breath. She can't find out. That sentence landed harder than the hand-holding. Because it told me two things instantly. First, there was something to find out. Second, they'd already discussed me like I wasn't in the room. And strangely enough, that hurt more than the touching. I should probably explain something about myself. I'm not a dramatic woman. Never have been. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a family where women swallowed embarrassment quietly and cleaned the kitchen afterward. My mother used to say, crying in public only gives people something to talk about. So instead of screaming or throwing wine like women do in movies, I simply sat down across from my husband of 38 years and unfolded my napkin carefully into my lap. The waiter arrived almost immediately with nervous timing. Can I get anybody another drink? Nobody answered. Poor kid looked maybe 22 years old and deeply unprepared for senior citizen emotional collapse. Finally, I said I'll take iced tea. Because apparently betrayal still doesn't stop Midwestern women from being polite. The waiter disappeared quickly. Robert sat back down slowly. Elaine still wouldn't look at me. That alone told me plenty. Elaine Harper had been my favorite cousin growing up. 2 years older than me, prettier than me too, if I'm honest. The kind of woman people noticed immediately in a room without her ever seeming aware of it. After her husband Frank died from pancreatic cancer 6 years earlier, she started spending more holidays with us. At first it felt natural. Compassionate. Right. Widowhood changes people in quiet ways unless you've lived through it yourself. Even though Robert and I stayed married, I understood loneliness better after retirement than I ever expected to. Your world gets smaller. Phone calls slow down. Children get busy. You start realizing how much of adulthood depends on people needing you for something. Elaine used to come over on Sundays after church. We'd eat pot roast and complain about our knees and watch old HGTV reruns together. Somewhere along the line, I stopped noticing how often Robert made her laugh. Or maybe I noticed and chose peace instead. Older marriages survive through selective blindness more often than younger people realize. The waiter returned with my iced tea. I thanked him automatically. Robert rubbed both hands together. Diane, he began carefully, this isn't an affair. Interesting choice of words. Not nothing happened. Not your misunderstanding. Just this isn't an affair. Elaine finally spoke without lifting her eyes. We were talking. I almost laughed. That's America's favorite explanation for emotional betrayal. We were talking. As if conversations can't destroy marriages slowly over time. I picked up the menu even though I already knew what I wanted. Ribeye, baked potato, dressing on the side. 38 years married and I still ordered the exact same anniversary dinner every year. Habit survives even when trust doesn't. Robert leaned forward slightly. You're late, he said. Like that was the issue. My sister needed help after physical therapy, I answered calmly. Silence settled over the table again. Outside the restaurant windows, snow drifted softly through the parking lot lights. First snow of December. Robert finally exhaled hard. We should go somewhere private and talk. No, I said quietly. Both of them looked surprised. I think they expected tears, anger, a scene. What they got instead was attention. And attention is much more dangerous. I spent the rest of dinner watching them carefully. The tiny things told the real story. Elaine stopped speaking any time Robert looked at me directly. Robert over-explained every sentence. Neither of them touched their food much. People having innocent conversations don't behave like suspects under fluorescent lighting. Halfway through dinner, Robert excused himself to the restroom. The second he disappeared around the corner, Elaine whispered, "I never meant for this to happen." There it was. Confirmation. Not full confession. But enough. I stirred lemon into my tea slowly. "How long?" I asked. Elaine's eyes filled immediately. "That's not fair." Interesting answer again. "Not nothing happened. Just don't ask for details." I suddenly felt exhausted. Not furious. Not shattered. Just tired in a way only long marriages can produce. The kind where betrayal feels less like a knife and more like discovering termites inside walls you painted together for decades. Robert returned carrying the check folder even though dessert hadn't arrived yet. Another sign. He wanted out of the restaurant. Out of visibility. Out of consequences. "Let's go home," he said quietly. Home. That word sounded strange suddenly. During the drive back, snow tapped softly against the windshield while Christmas music played low on the radio. Nobody talked. Robert drove with both hands gripping the wheel too tightly. Elaine followed behind us in her own car because she'd met us at the restaurant separately. That detail bothered me too. Separate arrivals require planning. When we pulled into our driveway, Robert shut off the engine but didn't move immediately. Finally, he said, "I didn't sleep with her. And maybe that should have comforted me. But it didn't. Because emotional abandonment can hollow out a marriage long before physical betrayal ever enters the room." Inside the house, Robert headed straight for the kitchen. I stayed near the staircase, removing my gloves slowly. That's when I saw it. The glow of his phone screen reflecting against the dark kitchen cabinets. And Robert hurriedly deleting messages before he realized I was watching him. That was the moment I understood something important. Whatever this was. It had already gone much further than hand-holding. The next morning I still made Robert coffee. That probably sounds pathetic to younger people. But after nearly 4 decades of marriage, your body keeps following routines long after your heart stops cooperating. I stood in our kitchen at 6:30 watching snow collect along the backyard fence, while the coffee maker hissed and sputtered like it always had. Robert came downstairs freshly shaved, dressed for absolutely nowhere because he'd been retired for almost 3 years. That was part of the problem, though. I didn't fully understand it yet. Retirement had hollowed him out in ways neither of us knew how to discuss honestly. "You sleep okay?" he asked carefully. I handed him his mug without answering. He took it anyway. That's marriage, too. Sometimes people keep accepting kindness they no longer deserve. We sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table while the local morning news talked about icy roads and delayed school openings. Finally, Robert said, "Nothing physical happened." There it was again. That phrase. Like betrayal only counts if bodies touch. I stared into my coffee. "How long have you been deleting messages?" Robert looked away immediately. A terrible sign after 38 years together. "Diane." "How long?" He rubbed his forehead slowly. "A few months?" "Months." I nodded once. That hurt less than I expected. Because deep down, women usually know long before evidence arrives. We just spend years negotiating with our instincts. The hardest part wasn't even Robert. It was Elaine. Elaine had sat at my table for holidays, held my granddaughter during Easter brunch, called me crying after her husband died. And somewhere inside all that ordinary family closeness, something shifted quietly enough that I missed it. Or maybe I chose not to see it because middle-aged women get tired of policing emotional atmospheres all the time. After Robert left for the gym, I drove to the grocery store mostly because I couldn't stand sitting in the house another minute. That's another thing older women do after emotional shock. We run errands, buy bananas, refill prescriptions, pretend life still operates normally. The cashier at Kroger asked if I found everything okay. I almost laughed in her face. Instead, I said yes, thank you. Midwestern politeness survives almost anything. On the drive home, memories kept surfacing whether I wanted them or not. Little things. Tiny things. Things that suddenly looked different under new light. Elaine defending Robert every time I complained about his emotional distance after retirement. Men struggle when they stop working, she'd once told me gently while drying dishes at Thanksgiving. Or the nights Robert stayed up texting after I went to bed. I assumed it was fantasy football with his old coworkers. Then there were the private jokes between them. Not flirtatious exactly. Just familiar in a way that slowly pushes a wife toward the edges of conversations happening inside her own home. At the time I told myself I was imagining things. Women our age get trained to distrust our discomfort. We call ourselves jealous, hormonal, oversensitive. Anything except correct. By the time I got home, my sister Carol had already called twice. Carol always knew something was wrong before I admitted it out loud. She answered on the first ring. "What happened?" I closed my eyes. "How do you always know?" "Because you only ignore my calls when you're trying not to cry. Sisters over 60 stop wasting time pretending." I told her everything. Or at least enough. The restaurant, the hand-holding, the whisper, the deleted messages. Carol stayed quiet longer than I expected. Finally, she asked, "Do you think they're sleeping together?" And honestly, that wasn't the question haunting me most. "I think he stopped talking to me a long time ago," I whispered. That silence on the phone afterward felt heavier than tears. Because Carol understood exactly what I meant. Long marriages don't usually collapse all at once. They erode. Quietly, politely, over years. That afternoon, I decided to do something I'd never done before in 38 years of marriage. I checked our bank account carefully. Not because Robert handled finances alone, we always shared everything openly. At least I thought we did. The first few pages looked normal: utilities, insurance, groceries, property taxes. Then I noticed repeated transfers. Small enough individually not to attract attention. $600, $900, $1,200. All sent to Elaine over the last 11 months. My chest tightened slowly. Not because of the money itself. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable enough. Robert had a decent pension from the utility company. I worked part-time at the church office until last spring. No. What hurt was secrecy. And duration. 11 months meant this relationship had developed while I helped Carol recover from knee surgery, organized family birthdays, visited Robert's cardiologist with him, sat beside him every night watching old crime shows like nothing underneath our marriage had changed. I printed the statements before I could lose my nerve. When Robert came home later that evening, snow still clung to his boots. He immediately noticed the papers spread across the dining room table. And the look on his face told me something important. Not panic. Recognition. Like he knew this moment had been coming eventually. He removed his coat slowly. "I can explain." I almost smiled. Men say that phrase like explanation reverses betrayal somehow. I tapped the bank statements gently. "You've been giving Elaine money for almost a year." Robert sat down heavily across from me. "She was behind on mortgage payments." "Why didn't you tell me?" "She was embarrassed." Interesting. Elaine's embarrassment mattered. Mine apparently didn't. "How much does she know about our marriage?" I asked quietly. Robert looked genuinely confused. "What? How much have you shared with her that you stopped sharing with me?" That question hit harder than the financial one. I saw it immediately in his face. Because suddenly this wasn't about charity anymore. It was about intimacy. Emotional intimacy. The kind that slowly relocates from one marriage into another relationship while nobody says the word affair out loud. Robert leaned back in his chair, looking older than 65 for the first time in years. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he whispered. There it was again. That phrase people use when they participated in something repeatedly but still want it treated like an accident. I folded the bank papers carefully into a neat stack. Then I asked the question I'd been avoiding since the restaurant. "When was the last time you talked to M.E. the way you talked to her?" Robert opened his mouth, then closed it. And honestly, that silence answered everything. The next 3 days passed like one long Midwest winter afternoon. Gray, quiet, heavy. Robert moved carefully around me inside the house like a man trying not to startle an injured animal. He loaded the dishwasher too quickly, folded laundry without being asked, offered to pick up groceries even though he hated grocery stores. Guilt turns some men helpful. But helpful and honest aren't the same thing. I still slept beside him those first few nights. Not because things were okay. Because after 38 years of marriage, sleeping in separate rooms feels less like independence and more like announcing a death. Besides, I needed time to think. Real thinking, not emotional panic. That Thursday morning, I found Robert sitting alone at the kitchen table staring at nothing while snow drifted past the windows again. Retirement had changed him physically over the past few years. Not in dramatic ways. Just quieter ones. He moved slower now, talked less, spent longer stretches sitting silently in the garage pretending to organize tools. When men stop feeling useful, loneliness starts leaking into strange places. I poured myself coffee and sat across from him. "We need to talk honestly today," I said. Robert nodded immediately, almost relieved. That surprised me. Usually guilty people avoid difficult conversations, but exhausted people don't. "What exactly are you and Elaine hiding?" I asked. He rubbed both hands together slowly. "She was struggling financially. I know about the money. She didn't want anyone else knowing." I stared at him. "You understand that secretly supporting another woman for almost a year sounds bad, right?" Robert winced slightly. "She's family." "No," I said quietly, "she's my family." That landed. Because deep down, Robert knew this betrayal wasn't only marital. It was personal. He looked toward the window. After Frank died, Elaine got really isolated. Frank. Her husband. Not mine. Even now, the overlap of names irritated me strangely. Robert continued carefully. "She'd call sometimes late at night, upset about bills or the house or being alone. And you became her emotional support system." He looked down. Not denial, not defense. Recognition. That hurt more. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. "When did you stop coming to ME with things?" Robert's eyes lifted slowly. "I don't know." That answer felt honest, which somehow made it worse. Long marriages rarely collapse from one terrible decision. Usually people drift one conversation at a time. One silence at a time. One lonely evening at a time. Finally, I asked the question that mattered most. "Did you sleep with her?" Robert answered immediately. "No." Too quickly. But not necessarily dishonestly. I watched him carefully. After 38 years, you learn the difference between rehearsed lies and painful truths. "I never touched her like that," he said quietly. Like that. Interesting wording again. Not "I never wanted to." Not "I never crossed boundaries." Just not like that. I suddenly realized I no longer trusted language itself inside my marriage. That afternoon, Elaine called. I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered on the fourth ring. Her breathing sounded shaky immediately. "Diane." I stayed silent. "I know you hate me." "Not yet," I answered honestly. That seemed to surprise her. People expect rage because rage feels cleaner than disappointment. "I never meant for this to happen," she whispered. There's that phrase again. Elaine started crying softly. Not manipulative crying. Real crying. Widow crying, ashamed crying, lonely crying. And honestly, that made everything harder. If she'd sounded cruel, I could have hated her more easily. Instead, she sounded broken. "I was lonely," she admitted. I closed my eyes. So was I. The silence after that sentence stretched painfully between us. Because both things were true. That's what makes older age betrayal so complicated sometimes. Nobody's usually chasing excitement. They're chasing relevance, comfort, attention, proof they still matter to someone. Elaine inhaled shakily. Robert listened to me. There it was. The real affair. Not sex, not hotel rooms. Attention. I leaned against the kitchen counter slowly. When did it start? I don't know. Again, probably honest. She continued quietly. When your mom got sick and you spent so much time in Columbus? I shut my eyes immediately. My mother's final year had consumed everything. Hospice appointments, medication schedules, overnight stays at assisted living facilities. I came home exhausted most nights, barely able to hold conversations longer than 5 minutes. Robert and Elaine started talking more during that period. Family dinners, phone calls, checking in on each other. Ordinary things. That's the frightening part. Emotional affairs often grow inside perfectly reasonable behavior. You should have told me, I whispered. Elaine cried harder after that. I know. And I think she truly did know. Too late, but genuinely. That evening, Robert grilled chicken outside, even though snow still covered half the backyard patio. Men his age sometimes cook outdoors during emotional crises, because standing over fire feels easier than discussing feelings directly. I watched him through the kitchen window for a long time before stepping outside in my coat. The cold hit immediately. Robert glanced up carefully. "We need to stop pretending this is only about helping Elaine," I said. Smoke drifted softly around us. Finally, Robert whispered, "I felt needed again." There it was. The real thing underneath everything. Retirement had emptied him. Then Elaine arrived needing advice, help, support, attention. And somewhere along the way he mistook being emotionally necessary for being emotionally alive. I suddenly saw the entire situation differently. Not better. Just clearer. Later that night, while Robert showered upstairs, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter beside me. Elaine's name lit the screen. I shouldn't have read the message. But after 38 years of loyalty, I felt entitled to one moment of dishonesty. The text was short. "I don't know how to fix this without destroying everyone." A few seconds later, another message appeared from Robert's side of the conversation. He had sent it earlier that afternoon. "Neither do I." I stared at the screen for a very long time. Because suddenly the situation felt painfully adult. No villains tying women to railroad tracks, no glamorous affair fantasy. Just aging people making selfish emotional choices quietly enough to almost convince themselves nobody was getting hurt. Almost. 3 weeks after I found the messages, our entire family drove to Lake Cumberland for the annual Miller family vacation. Yes, we still went. That probably sounds insane to younger people, but folks my age understand something important about long marriages and adult families. Sometimes disaster arrives after deposits become non-refundable. Besides, our daughters had already rented the lake house months earlier. Grandkids were excited, groceries were bought, matching Christmas pajama photos had already been planned in somebody's group text. So we packed the SUV and pretended normality still existed. That's another American family tradition nobody talks about enough. Maintaining appearances while emotionally bleeding internally. The drive from Ohio to Kentucky took almost 5 hours. Robert drove. I stared out the passenger window watching winter fields slide past in silence. Neither of us mentioned Elaine. Which was impressive considering she was following directly behind us in her own car. Our oldest daughter Megan arrived first with her husband and 2 boys. Younger daughter Rachel showed up later carrying enough snacks to survive a natural disaster. Everybody hugged, everybody laughed, everybody performed family. Meanwhile, I felt like someone attending my own marriage funeral in comfortable shoes. The lake house itself was beautiful in that rustic Airbnb sort of way. Stone fireplace, huge wooden deck-plaid blankets nobody actually used. Outside, the lake looked gray and still beneath low December clouds. Robert immediately became overly cheerful. That was his stress response. He carried luggage too fast, opened wine bottles nobody asked for, volunteered to cook every meal. Overcompensation has a smell once you recognize it. Elaine stayed quieter. She avoided being alone with me completely, which honestly made things worse. At least cowardice gives clarity. The first 2 days passed in careful emotional choreography. Nobody knew officially what had happened yet, but adult children sense tension faster than parents realize. Rachel cornered me in the kitchen the second morning while I scrambled eggs. "You okay?" I kept stirring the eggs. "Why?" "You and Dad are acting weird." Interesting choice of singular noun. Not weird separately. Weird together. "I'm tired," I answered. Rachel studied me carefully. At 34, she'd inherited my unfortunate ability to notice emotional shifts immediately. "You know," she said slowly, "you don't have to protect everybody all the time." That sentence irritated me because it was accurate. Women from my generation often confuse emotional management with love. So I changed the subject and asked about her office Christmas party instead. Deflection, another family skill passed down genetically. That evening, everybody gathered around the fireplace after dinner while the grandkids watched some animated movie upstairs. Robert sat beside me on the couch. Too close. Like proximity alone could repair trust. Across the room, Elaine laughed nervously at something Megan's husband said. Then her eyes accidentally met mine. She looked away immediately. Guilt ages people quickly. Later that night I couldn't sleep. The lake house creaked softly in the winter wind. Somewhere upstairs a toilet flushed. Robert slept beside me, breathing heavily, one arm stretched across the mattress toward my side without touching me. That almost broke my heart more than the betrayal itself. Because even now some unconscious part of him still reached for me in the dark. I slipped quietly from bed and pulled on my coat. Outside cold air hit my lungs sharply. The dock stretched across black water, reflecting moonlight in broken silver lines. And there was Elaine, standing alone near the railing, wrapped in one of my old scarves. She startled when she saw me. "I couldn't sleep," she said immediately. Neither could I. For a minute we just stood there listening to water slap gently beneath the dock. Then Elaine started crying. Not loud. Just exhausted crying. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words floated into the cold night air between us. I folded my arms tightly. "Did you love him?" Elaine looked stunned by the question. Finally she answered honestly. "I loved not feeling alone." That hurt because it sounded true. Not romantic, not glamorous. Just lonely. Widow loneliness. Aging loneliness. The kind nobody prepares women for after 60. Elaine wiped her face quickly. "I never planned this." Again that phrase. People rarely plan emotional dependence. It grows quietly while everyone's distracted by ordinary life. "You know what the worst part is?" I asked softly. Elaine shook her head. "I trusted you inside my home." That landed. She covered her mouth immediately, trying not to cry harder. The lake wind moved through bare trees around us. Finally, Elaine whispered, "I think Robert felt invisible after retirement." I looked out across the water. I'd noticed it too. The long afternoons, the endless garage projects, the way he lingered after small conversations with strangers because nobody needed him urgently anymore. Men retire from jobs. Women often retire from being needed. Neither transition is graceful. He liked helping me, Elaine admitted quietly. And suddenly I understood the emotional exchange underneath everything. Elaine needed support. Robert needed usefulness. Need can imitate love frighteningly well sometimes. Back inside the house later, I found Robert awake, sitting at the kitchen counter under dim lights. He looked up immediately when I entered. "Where were you?" "Talking to Elaine." His face drained slightly. "Interesting." Not jealousy. Fear. "What did she say?" I removed my scarf carefully. "She said you liked feeling needed." Robert stared at the countertop a long time after that. Then he whispered something I'll never forget. I didn't realize how empty retirement made me until somebody started depending on me again. No defensiveness. No excuses. Just honesty. Painfully late honesty. I suddenly felt older than I had all year. Not because of betrayal. Because I realized how easily people can drift toward emotional disaster, simply trying to outrun irrelevance. Before bed, I stood alone in the upstairs bathroom, removing my wedding ring slowly. Not dramatically. Not permanently. Just thoughtfully. Then I placed it beside the sink and stared at the pale indentation it left on my finger after 38 years. Some absences look shocking once the weight disappears. The truth finally came out 3 days after Christmas. Not through confession. Not through courage. Through technology. Which honestly feels very American now. Our younger daughter Rachel called me at 8:30 that morning while I was standing in line at the pharmacy picking up blood pressure medication. "Mom," she said quietly, "I need you to come over." Something in her voice made my stomach tighten immediately. Not panic. Disappointment. There's a difference. By the time I reached Rachel's house, snowmelt dripped steadily from the gutters and gray slush lined the sidewalks. Robert's truck was already parked outside. Bad sign. Inside, the atmosphere felt wrong instantly. Too quiet. Rachel stood near the dining room table holding an iPad against her chest. Megan sat beside the window looking pale. Robert stared at the floor like a teenage boy waiting outside the principal's office. And Elaine was crying softly into a tissue on the couch. Nobody said hello. Rachel finally spoke first. The boys were using Grandpa's old iPad for games. My chest tightened slowly. Shared devices. Modern marriage's worst enemy. Rachel swallowed hard. His messages synced onto it. There it was. No more guessing, no more ambiguity, no more adults carefully translating betrayal into softer language. Just evidence. Megan looked at me carefully. Mom, how long have you known? Interesting question. Not, is it true? Because deep down, adult children always know before parents officially admit family fractures. A few weeks, I answered quietly. Rachel looked horrified. You didn't tell us. I almost laughed. Children in their 30s still think parents exist mainly to absorb emotional damage privately. I was trying not to destroy Christmas, I said. Robert closed his eyes after that. Good. He should hear what this actually cost people. Rachel placed the iPad slowly onto the table. I read enough, she whispered. Not all, enough. That word mattered. Because emotional affairs rarely expose themselves through one scandalous message. They reveal themselves through accumulation, comfort dependence, daily intimacy redirected away from marriage. Megan finally looked directly at her father. Were you in love with her? Robert looked completely lost for a second. Like a man discovering emotions become uglier once spoken aloud by your children. I don't know, he admitted. That honesty damaged Rachel more than denial would have. You risked our family over something you don't know. Robert rubbed his forehead hard. It wasn't supposed to become this. Again. That phrase. Elaine suddenly spoke through tears. Please stop blaming only him. Rachel turned sharply toward her. You're my mother's cousin. Simple sentence, devastating impact. Elaine nodded weakly. I know. The room went quiet except for the hum of Rachel's refrigerator. Outside, neighborhood kids were sledding down the hill across the street. Their laughter drifted faintly through the windows while our family sat inside emotional wreckage. That contrast almost broke me. Normal life continuing while private worlds collapse. Megan folded her arms tightly. Did Grandpa know? My breath caught immediately. Their grandfather, my father. Dead 12 years now. What I asked softly. Megan looked embarrassed. I just mean, was their marriage like this too? There it was. The real fear underneath every family scandal. Inheritance. Not money. Patterns. People desperately wanting to know whether love ever stays safe long term. I sat down slowly at the table. No, I said quietly. But your father and I made mistakes too. Robert looked up at me then. Surprised. Probably because I wasn't trying to publicly destroy him. Revenge sounds satisfying in fantasy. In real families, humiliation spreads like smoke and poisons everybody eventually. Rachel wiped beneath her eyes angrily. How does something like this even happen? Nobody answered immediately. Then I did. Quietly. Everyone looked at me. I folded my hands together carefully. People think betrayal begins with hotels and sex and dramatic secrets. Most of the time it starts much smaller. The room stayed completely still. With loneliness, I continued softly. With conversations spouses stop having. With feeling unseen for too long and not admitting it honestly. Elaine cried harder after that. Robert stared at the floor. I wasn't defending them. I was explaining adulthood. And adulthood is often less cinematic than people want. Megan looked exhausted suddenly. So what now? That question hung heavily over the room. What now? After 38 years of marriage, after children, after grandkids, after shared mortgages and funerals and Christmas mornings and retirement plans, nobody prepares older couples for rebuilding trust because society assumes long marriages automatically become emotionally safe. They don't. They become whatever people keep feeding quietly over time. Robert finally spoke. I crossed boundaries. Simple sentence. Important sentence. I lied, he continued, repeatedly. Rachel started crying silently after that. Not because she hated him. Because watching parents become flawed human beings hurts adult children in strange, delayed ways. Elaine stood slowly from the couch. I should leave. Nobody stopped her. But before she reached the door, she turned toward me. I never wanted your life, she whispered. I believed her. That was the tragedy. This wasn't a glamorous affair driven by passion. It was emotional hunger between aging people terrified of becoming unnecessary. Still wrong, still destructive. but painfully human. After Elaine left, silence settled heavily through the house. Finally, I stood too. I'm staying with Carol for a while. Robert looked stunned despite everything. Diane, I can't sit across from you at breakfast pretending this is manageable right now. He nodded slowly. No argument, no manipulation. Just grief. Upstairs, I packed an overnight bag while hearing muffled voices downstairs drift through heating vents. Rachel crying, Megan asking practical questions, Robert speaking softly. Family damage sounds strangely ordinary from another room. Before leaving, I paused near the front door. Robert stood there looking older than I'd ever seen him. Not guilty anymore. Just frightened. I am sorry, he whispered. And maybe he truly was. But apologies arrive late in long marriages sometimes. Late enough that they echo instead of repair. I picked up my coat carefully. Then I walked out into the freezing Ohio evening, feeling something I hadn't expected after all these years. Not rage. Loneliness. My sister Carol lived in a small brick ranch house 20 minutes outside Dayton with a yellow front door and entirely too many bird feeders. I stayed there for almost 6 weeks. Long enough for the neighbors to stop pretending they weren't curious. That's one thing about growing older in America. People become more polite publicly and more observant privately. Carol never pushed me to talk. Good sisters know when silence is healing and when it's hiding. She seemed to understand I was still figuring out which one mine was. Most mornings we drank coffee in her sunroom watching cardinals fight over seeds while daytime television murmured in the background. Very glamorous separation. No lawyers screaming, no dramatic affairs exposed online. Just 2 Medicare-aged women discussing cholesterol medication while my marriage quietly sat in cardiac arrest. The strange thing was, once I stopped actively surviving emotional shock, I realized how tired I'd been long before Elaine entered the picture. Marriage can slowly turn women into managers of everybody else's comfort. Schedules, birthdays, doctor appointments, holiday plans, emotional temperature. And somewhere along the line, I stopped noticing how little space remained for me. One Tuesday afternoon, Carol looked up from her crossword puzzle and said, "You know you're smiling more now." That irritated me immediately. Because she was right. Not happier, just lighter. There's relief in no longer pretending things are fine. I started volunteering twice a week at the church food pantry, mostly to avoid sitting around replaying 40 years of marriage inside my head. Older women need usefulness too. We just hide it better than men sometimes. The pantry smelled like canned soup and industrial coffee. Most volunteers were retired women with sensible sneakers and painful hips. I liked them immediately. Nobody there cared about emotional scandals. They cared about expired cereal boxes and whether Mrs. Donnelly's grandson needed winter gloves. Real life has a way of shrinking personal drama back to human size. Meanwhile, Robert started therapy. That sentence alone would have shocked the version of him from 10 years earlier. But retirement had cracked him open emotionally in ways he could no longer ignore. He called every Sunday evening. Not begging, not pressuring. Just checking in. The first few calls stayed painfully polite. "How's Carol Rhodes bad over there? You still taking your blood pressure medication?" 38 years of intimacy reduced to weather reports and prescription reminders. Then one night he finally said something real. I didn't realize how invisible I felt after retirement. I sat quietly holding the phone against my ear while rain tapped softly against Carol's windows. "You were never invisible to me," I answered. Robert exhaled shakily. "I know, that almost makes it worse." And honestly, I understood what he meant. Because feeling loved and feeling useful aren't always the same thing. Especially for aging Americans raised to tie identity directly to productivity. A week later, Elaine asked if she could meet me for coffee. I almost said no. But avoidance had already damaged enough lives, so we met at a little diner off Route 48, where retirees gathered every morning to complain about taxes and refill coffee endlessly. Elaine looked thinner. Guilt does that too. She wrapped both hands around her mug like she was cold even inside the heated restaurant. "I started grief counseling," she said quietly. I nodded once. "How's that going?" She gave a sad little laugh. "Apparently loneliness makes people emotionally reckless." That sounded painfully accurate. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things instead: her leaking roof, my arthritis, Carol's blood pressure. Older women often circle emotional truth slowly before approaching it directly. Finally, Elaine looked at me with tears standing in her eyes. I think after Frank died, I stopped believing anybody would choose me first ever again. That sentence changed something inside me. Not forgiveness exactly. Perspective. Widowhood rearranges people psychologically in ways married folks often underestimate. The world slowly stops centering you. Calls slow down, invitations decrease. Couples unconsciously treat you like temporary company instead of permanent family. Elaine had been starving emotionally long before Robert entered the picture. Still not an excuse, but explanations matter when you're trying to age without bitterness hardening permanently inside you. What about Robert? I asked quietly. Elaine looked down immediately. He listened. Again, the real affair. Attention, dependence, comfort. Small emotional substitutions repeated long enough to become betrayal. Before we left the diner, Elaine whispered, I never wanted to replace you. I believed her now. Because replacement was never really the point. They were both trying to outrun loneliness using each other. And loneliness makes aging people dangerous in very ordinary ways. That evening, Robert came to Carol's house for the first time. He stood awkwardly on the porch holding grocery store flowers like every guilty husband in Ohio before him. Carol opened the door, took one look at him and muttered, Don't make me regret letting you in. Honestly fair. Robert sat across from me at Carol's kitchen table looking terrified. Good. Fear meant honesty might finally happen. For a while neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, I became emotionally lazy with you. That sentence hit harder than I'm sorry. Because it was specific. True. Adult. He continued staring at his hands. You handled everything for so many years. I stopped showing up emotionally because I assumed you'd always carry us. I felt tears rise unexpectedly after that. Not because he'd fixed anything. Because he finally understood something real. Marriage doesn't usually die from explosive moments. It dies from accumulated neglect people normalize slowly over decades. Robert looked up carefully. I miss talking to you honestly. I wiped beneath one eye quickly. We stopped being honest years ago. He nodded. No defense, no excuses. Just agreement. And for the first time since the restaurant, I saw a possible future that wasn't built entirely on resentment. Not guaranteed reconciliation. Not fairy tale healing. Just two aging people finally learning how to speak truth before loneliness spoke for them again. The first time Robert and I attended a family event together after separating was our granddaughter Emma's winter choir concert in March. Carol helped me pick out my sweater like I was going on a first date, instead of sitting beside my emotionally confused husband in a middle school auditorium. Too fancy, I asked, holding up a navy cardigan. You're not auditioning for the Golden Bachelor, Carol muttered from the couch. That made me laugh harder than it should have. Humor returned slowly after heartbreak. That's how you know healing started. The school auditorium smelled like coffee, wet coats, and cafeteria pizza. Folding chairs scraped against the floor while grandparents argued over seating rows like military operations. Normal American family life? I spotted Robert near the back holding 2 cups of hot chocolate from the concession stand. He looked nervous when he saw me. Good. Some relationships deserve caution after betrayal. You still hate auditorium coffee? He asked awkwardly. Yes. So I got hot chocolate. Tiny thing. But after 38 years, tiny things carry entire emotional histories inside them. We sat together quietly while children in oversized choir uniforms shuffled onto risers beneath fluorescent lights. Neither of us touched the subject immediately. That was progress too. Pain no longer controlled every conversation. Halfway through the concert, Emma spotted us sitting together and smiled so hard she missed part of her cue. Rachel noticed too. From 3 rows ahead, she glanced back at us with visible relief. Adult children never stop hoping their parents will somehow remain emotionally safe places. Even after disappointment. After the concert, everyone gathered in the hallway while grandparents took blurry photos and children ran wild on sugar and adrenaline. Robert stood beside me awkwardly while Emma showed off a paper snowflake decoration she made in art class. For one strange moment, we almost looked normal again. Not healed. Just familiar. Later that evening, Robert asked if I wanted dinner. I hesitated, then said yes. Not because forgiveness arrived magically. Because avoiding every difficult conversation forever is its own kind of loneliness. We ended up at a small diner outside town where we used to eat as newlyweds after late factory shifts and cheap movie dates. The booths were smaller than I remembered. Or maybe we were older. Country music played softly above the clatter of silverware. A waitress around 60 called everyone Han without sounding fake about it. We ordered almost automatically. His meatloaf, my turkey sandwich. Some habits survive even separation. For a while, we just watched snowmelt drip down the diner windows. Finally, Robert spoke. My therapist asked me something last week. I stirred cream into my coffee slowly. What? He asked when I first started feeling unnecessary. That word settled heavily between us. Unnecessary. Retirement does that to people sometimes, especially men raised to measure their worth through work schedules and paychecks and fixing things nobody else can fix. What did you tell him? I asked quietly. Robert smiled sadly. I said probably 6 months after retirement. I nodded slowly. That tracked. That's when he started lingering at hardware stores, volunteering for pointless repairs, offering advice nobody asked for. Loneliness disguised as usefulness. Robert stared out the window. Elaine needed me, he admitted softly, and I confused that feeling with being loved. There it was. The real truth underneath the entire story. Not passion, not lust, not some glamorous late-life affair. Just aging people terrified of emotional irrelevance. I looked down at my wedding ring. I'd started wearing it again 2 weeks earlier. Not as forgiveness, as history. Robert noticed immediately. His eyes softened, but he didn't comment. That restraint mattered more than pressure would have. I wasn't innocent either, I admitted quietly. Robert looked startled. I stopped talking honestly years ago. I got so busy managing life that I forgot marriages need attention too. That's not your fault. No, I said softly. But it is my responsibility. That distinction matters once you get older. Blame becomes less useful than accountability. The waitress refilled our coffees while a group of retired men near the counter argued loudly about baseball. Normal life continued all around us. That comforted me strangely. Heartbreak feels enormous inside one family. Outside it, the world keeps serving pie and discussing weather forecasts. Robert folded his hands carefully on the table. I don't expect things to go back to normal. They can't. He nodded immediately. No denial. Growth sometimes sounds very quiet. What do you want now? He asked. I thought about that honestly before answering. Not revenge, not punishment. Just honesty. I want us to stop protecting ourselves from difficult conversations, I said, even when it's uncomfortable. Robert smiled sadly. We spent 38 years doing exactly that. Yes, I answered, and look where it got us. But there wasn't cruelty in the sentence anymore. Just truth. Outside the parking lot reflected soft orange streetlights across wet pavement. Early spring air moved gently against the diner windows. I suddenly realized something important. The deepest damage in our marriage hadn't come from Elaine. It came from years of emotional silence we both normalized because routine felt safer than vulnerability. Elaine simply entered the empty space we never acknowledged openly. That realization didn't erase pain, but it stopped pain from turning into hatred. Months later, our family still carried scars. Rachel trusted more cautiously. Megan watched relationships differently now. Elaine remained part of holidays, though, with gentler boundaries and harder honesty. And Robert and I? We kept talking. Slowly, awkwardly, truthfully. At our age, that counts as hope. If this story touched you, maybe take a moment to think about the quiet silences inside your own relationships, the conversations postponed too long, the loneliness hidden beneath routines, the people who may simply want to feel seen again. And if you believe stories like this matter, I hope you'll share your thoughts, subscribe, and join us again for more deeply human stories about family, love, regret, and second chances.